Objections to Marx's theory of value often have to do with the way his theory of value relates to market prices. If value comes from the amount of labor that goes into producing things, then how do we explain the fact that a rise or fall in demand changes market prices? The fact that demand influences price makes it seem like subjective decisions influence value as much as labor time. The value-price relation is a complex one, and I will deal with it in greater detail in a future video, Law of Value 11. But a few remarks are in order here. We've actually covered this ground briefly before in Law of Value 3, where we talked about the way private labor becomes social labor. Private labor is the amount of labor an individual worker devotes to the production of a commodity. The goal of the worker is for her private labor to become social labor, that is, that her commodity be sold in the market and thus be equated with all other commodities in the market, making her labor part of the total social labor of society. But this isn't so easy. Because production is only coordinated through the fluctuation of market signals, it is always uncertain whether commodities will be sold and whether private labor will become social labor. As we've seen in previous videos, in order for private labor to become social, it must produce at the socially necessary labor time. Socially necessary labor time is a way in which the social level of productivity acts back upon the private labor of the individual, disciplining the individual to work at the social average. Individuals or firms that can't work at the socially necessary labor time go out of business, like when American auto workers lose their jobs due to competition with plants in other countries. Their labor is then reallocated to other areas where they can be more profitable, or they don't work at all. As many of us know, losing a job and having to find new work is a long, hard, painful process, but these discomforts don't matter to the market. The market treats all labor like digits in a calculator, anonymous units to be moved around in search of profit. The gap between private labor and social labor is the mechanism by which labor is moved around and reapportioned through the blind forces of the market in the absence of a social plan. Now, all of this should sound familiar, but what does this have to do with the relation between demand changes and price? Well, the same process of reapportioning labor happens with changes in demand. Just like the need to produce at the socially necessary labor time, society must also apportion the right amount of labor to produce the right amount of things so that markets don't become oversaturated or understocked. If the supply of elevator music exceeds demand, then some of this music will remain unsold, and some of this private labor will not become social. Producers will be forced to move their labor elsewhere. This apportioning of labor happens through the fluctuation of price. This does not mean that demand creates value. Demand hasn't created anything. It has merely indicated, through price signals, that labor needs to be reallocated. This is how demand affects the distribution of social labor in a society coordinated through the fluctuations of prices. This distribution is only possible because there is a relation between price and labor time. So we can show that demand, rather than creating value, is part of the reallocation of labor that is implied in the gap between private and social labor. But we can also take this analysis further and show how demand itself is produced in capitalism. From the perspective of Subjectivist Island, it seems like demand is the product of free, independent minds, viewing reality from some distant, objective standpoint. But in reality, our subjectivity is a part of the mode of production. This is nowhere more apparent than in the capitalist mode of production. In capitalism, the only type of demand that counts is effective demand, that is, demand backed up by purchasing power. Consumer demand comes from wages paid to workers. That means we can't understand demand without first understanding wage labor and exploitation. The products which consumers buy with this money are not just the random result of psychological preferences. In fact, most of our money goes to the purchase of very basic things we need in order to keep us alive as workers so that we can produce more value for capitalism each day. Rent, food, clothes. These are needs and desires dictated to us by capitalism for the purpose of perpetuating capitalism, not the abstract psychological preferences of isolated individuals. But the bulk of demand in society comes not from consumers, but from capitalists. You and I buy toothbrushes and pay rent. Capitalists buy factories, assembly lines, natural resources, and private armies. This demand has nothing to do with the personal preferences of capitalists. It has to do with the technical requirements of production, the amount of inputs it takes to make a widget at the socially necessary labor time. Some people think that capitalists enter production only in order to meet the demands of consumers. This is a myth. The advertising industry is the best refutation of this myth. Capitalists produce in order to make a profit. Then they go looking for markets. Most of the time, they have to create the market by convincing people there is a need for their product. But capitalist firms also sell to each other, totally bypassing the need to find consumer markets. This all gives us a very different picture of the subject-object relation than we get in bourgeois economics. Rather than a free society of empowered individuals who are free to act upon their abstract desires and take full responsibility for their lot in life, Marx's critique of the capitalist mode of production reveals a world in which individuals are at the mercy of the coercive laws of the market. The sorts of superficial freedoms they have to choose between Coke and Pepsi pale in comparison to the disciplining of our lives to socially necessary labor time and the pursuit of profit.